Hello, my name's Maureen Smoikis. I'm very pleased to introduce this film of a conversation with Thomas Szasz on behalf of the Centre of Excellence in Interdisciplinary Mental Health. This series of seminars offers an opportunity for dialogue, exploring, challenging and critiquing the historical and contemporary notions of mental health. In each seminar, an individual who has made a global contribution to the area of mental health will be invited to converse with an interdisciplinary audience, including service users and carers, educators, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, social workers and academics. In this first seminar, we're very pleased to invite Thomas Szasz. He gives an overview of the ideas and views he has developed and written about over the past 60 years and opens the conversation and offers opportunity for debate. We hope that you'll find this first section interesting, and if you would like to see the rest of the film, please contact the Centre for information.
So, once again, Thomas, can I welcome you to the Centre of Excellence in Interdisciplinary Mental Health. Thank you for starting our series off for us, and can I invite you to make a statement about some of the main ideas that you've contributed to thinking about mental health and some of the ways in which you think those ideas make connections with the current services that all of us are either working in, writing about, researching or teaching about.
It's a pleasure to be here because I anticipated speaking to a very open-minded group, which is not typically the case in this field, in psychiatry more specifically, which has been my identity in a way. Now, I'm going to try to keep my comments relatively brief because I think we'll get more out of an exchange. And I also like to reiterate that I hope you will speak, ask questions or make statements, disagreements, whatever you like. Now, let me begin with examining the words we use to communicate, which is after all our tool. Now, we talk about mental health services, mental illness, and so on. That is a fundamental building block, which is always a starting point. I built my career on challenging this concept. The question is, what is it that we are talking about when we talk about mental illness or mental health? What is this? A 17th century English jurist, whom I have often quoted, who said this, obviously, 300 years ago at least, that before we discuss and analyze something, and especially make recommendations about it, we better be sure what the it is. So what is this it? Well, I am not quite sure I know what it is, although I think I have a good idea of what I have a very good idea of what it is not. Now, in my opinion, it is not illness in the strict medical sense. Now, very briefly, what do I mean by illness? I mean by illness what is the product of the scientific revolution, which is really the concept of illness we are talking about only goes back to roughly 1850. As you well know, if you go before 1800 and up into the 19th century, the idea of illness as a humoral imbalance was what dominated the world thinking throughout for more than 2,000 years. That the disease is a humoral imbalance. Now, these humors, of course, we now believe didn't exist. The whole thing was a fictional explanation, not much better than the explanations based on ghosts and unicorns or other fictions. So, illness in this medical sense is a bodily lesion, something wrong with the human anatomy or physiology. It essentially belongs to physics and chemistry. It has to be something measurable, identifiable objectively. A slipped disc in the back, an infected tooth, cancer, heart disease, stroke, and so on, diabetes, and hundreds of diseases. Now, insofar as this relates to mental illness, it relates to it very importantly because obviously the brain is a part of our body. And this is the origin of the confusion. Now, if people have a brain disease, brain injury, originally, typically, was a very common disease, neurosyphilis. Untreated syphilis very often goes on to a late stage where the brain is infected. The person has essentially an infection of the brain, which usually kills him in 2 or 3 years after. Now, these people, of course, went mad. And they were undifferentiated from people who were mad but did not have syphilis, or did not have anything identifiable with their head. Now, the way this works out now in the modern world is that if you have something that's identifiable by doctors, then it's called neurology or neurosurgery, cancer of the brain, infection of the brain, brain tumor. If it's not, then people talk about mental illness. And then they talk about finding the lesion. In schizophrenia, it's due to various chemical imbalances, or, this gave rise to the idea of reverberating circuits, lobotomy, various treatments, all based on the idea that there is something wrong with the body. Well, I don't think it's that. To make it simple, I believe it belongs in the same category as language, literature, beauty, art. It is a human phenomenon, a human product. It is something that people make or people experience. It's essentially an experience is perhaps the best single category for it. The operative word here is meaning. If you'd have this point of view, and this is, by the way, I didn't dream this up from the ground up. Don't give me too much, or if you like, don't give me any credit for any of this. Everything we do, every behavior, every action, as distinguished from things that happen to us, these are very important verbs. Everything we do in this scheme has meaning, including, of course, gestures, of which sign language is a beautiful example, but all body movements communicate something. Even the way we look, the way we dress, the way we make up ourselves, our hair, everything communicates something, which is our doing. Now, this is the realm of mental illness and mental health, in my opinion. The question is, why do some people operate in some way that other people notice and then label? Because in the ordinary course of events, everybody assumes that everybody else is, quotes, normal. Now, how does the idea of mental illness arise? It arises, it is a synonym, essentially, with the old English word eccentric, odd. It has the added connotation that this is something undesirable and should be gotten rid of. Typically, again, I'm using standard psychiatric terminology, hallucinations and delusions. Now, these are the psychiatric words. Now, I think of these things in different terms, which means in different way. I think that hallucinations is a form of talking to ourselves. When people hear voices, they hear voices. I'm not doubting the experience. But since nobody is talking to them, they're hearing themselves. Essentially like in dreaming. Now, if you dream, you may have very disturbing dreams which you feel like disowning. How could I dream this? Well, there was nobody else there. You dreamt it. So to me, this is my premise. I have no way of proving this, but this is, to me, self-evident. Now, the same thing with delusion. Even more obviously, a delusion is a belief that other people call a delusion, because it is very unusual or perhaps very threatening. Like you have the delusion that God is talking to you and your wife is a witch and you should poison her. The sooner the better. Or that voices are telling you to go up to a high building and jump off. Sorry, that's hallucination. Another delusion. Well, any belief that's an unusual belief can be or is called a delusion. I mean, it's typically bizarre so-called bizarre religious beliefs. Now, they are bizarre because they are not standard. So these are really extremely powerful but misleading terms, because it implies that you have a delusion, there is something wrong in your head. Right? No more follows. And if you talk Hungarian or German, there's something wrong in your head. You know, you are using a different vocabulary. Now, to show you how right I am and how absurd standard psychiatry is, let's pick on what psychiatrists think is a mental illness. And I will pick one which was a leading mental illness throughout the major part of my career. Played an immensely important part. In fact, I wrote a book published as late as 1970, one of my quite successful books called The Manufacture of Madness, in which 2 chapters are devoted to this illness. This illness is called homosexuality. What happened to it? The American Psychiatric Association voted that it's no longer an illness. Well, voting is a political process. You can't vote on carcinoma of the pancreas, or on melanoma, or on malaria, whether it's an illness. So this is laughable. But it's very serious, because in psychiatric history, this is not the only example. I mean, I've written books on this. I mean, this is... The diagnosis of hysteria, by the way, was eliminated officially in 1980. You shake your head.
It's got another name, but it's basically still there.
That's all I said. The diagnosis is a name. There is nothing else but a name. The diagnosis is like Thomas Szasz. Now, I could change my name too. I would still be the same person. Well, anyway, that's my view. Well, this leads to a kind of a global philosophical religious observation. And that is that the way the term mental illness and mental health are used, especially colloquially, journalistically, in everyday life, in the United States, but as far as I know in England too, and in other countries, although some other languages don't even have the word mind. The way we use this term implies that if there was no mental illness, then people would live mentally healthy lives and there would be essentially no problems. They would have no problems. Now, I think this is a completely nonsensical view, because it denies the fact that no matter what you do, life is a continuous series of challenges and problems with which you have to cope. That life, to put it very bluntly, is both a blessing, an infinite blessing, and perhaps an even more infinite burden, which explains why people go mad and why people kill themselves. It is not because they are mentally ill, it is because life has become too unpleasant. Now, let me conclude with a remark that one of the things which I have always felt, and I was personally perfectly pleased with it, but I think this is a big problem with people reading my books, and that is that the subject matter that certainly I address is much too simple. People want some complicated explanation. They want some chemicals in the brain. They want something, quantum mechanics, something that they don't understand to explain it. That this simple, essentially, I am not personally religious, so I don't want to mislead you, but this is essentially a kind of a religious view. That life is no picnic. You know, if you like, we are born in original sin, or we have to constantly struggle to understand God better, and we never get there. That this is and it doesn't matter what we do, because if we solve some problem, you know, whatever, medically, chemically, by mastering something, then if we keep on living, we'll do something else, and then that will be a problem. Typically, if we are not married, we want to be married. That will solve a problem. Then we have new problems. The same thing with children. If we don't have children, we want children. Then that's a problem, because we will have children. And they will give us a problem. And the same thing, on and on and on, until we die. That's why on the gravestone it says, requiescat in pacem, rest in peace. That's the only place where is peace. And in madness. It's a retreat. There's more peace, relatively. So, thank you very much for listening.